We're live.
Hey, thank you, Larry the Liberty Guy. Welcome back to In the Dugout. I'm your host, Mike Stenhouse. And again, we're back for a special edition summer show. We haven't been doing shows regularly, as you know, over the summer, but this week, two shows because it's just so much important news going on. Today, we're going to break some really big news. We had an interview earlier today with Representative Charlene Lima and Representative Brian Newberry in the Rhode Island General Assembly. Big news, breaking news, important news that could change the direction of this state will be discussed. So stay tuned. We'll show you that interview from earlier today in just a few minutes. Tomorrow, we will have another show at 5 p.m. this week with Dr. Andrew Boston, all things COVID, again, with the FDA giving now formal approval of the vaccine. It's no longer, quote, experimental, at least the Pfizer version. We're going to talk about that and so many other things related to COVID. So tune in tomorrow. Now I'm going to put on my cap today, and I'm going to put on my Coeur d'Alene hat from the resort in Idaho. If you remember, Coeur d'Alene means heart of the awl. It was named by the French after the Indians in that region of the country who were experts at making skins, and they needed to use awls, as you know, to poke holes in the skin and then tie the leather so you could strap pieces of leather together. That's just the name of it, Coeur d'Alene, heart of the awl. Well, the news you're going to hear in just a few minutes really is going to poke a hole, if you would, to use the awl analogy, in the Democrats' unified front, in the Democrat dam, if you would, water dam, that is, that is supporting this governor and is really probably unconstitutional emergency powers. One of the reps you're going to hear from in just a few minutes maybe poked a hole in that unified front. You know, in a state where COVID-19 rates and case infection rates and fatality rates have been among the highest in the country. And we're also, our economic performance and our recovery from the pandemic have been among the worst in the country. We thought the Rhode Island General Assembly did a good thing earlier this summer when it stepped in and in the budget kind of slipped in quietly a provision that for all intents and purposes ended the governor's emergency executive powers. But as we have seen in just the last week, the governor had a major trick up his sleeve. Was the General Assembly complicit in this? Did the governor do an end round around the General Assembly in declaring this new state of emergency? We're going to discuss that shortly with our guests, but you're going to hear a lot more commentary from me about this. I mean, I have some very, very pointed and provocative, maybe even controversial comments to make on this, but my commentary will come after the interviews we've got coming up with the representatives and Judge Robert Flanders, who will shortly give his legal perspective on everything we're talking about today. Big news broken on In the Dugout today. Okay, joining me now are representatives from the Rhode Island General Assembly, Representative Charlene Lima, a Democrat from the Cranston and Providence area. Representative Lima, welcome to In the Dugout.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Mike.
And also joining us is Representative Brian Newberry, Republican, representing Burrville, North Smithfield. Brian, I know you've been on our show before. Welcome back to In the Dugout.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. Apologies, I don't have my Montreal Expos cap. I'm actually in my real office, so. Yeah,
well, and okay, gotcha. Of course, wearing caps in the dugout is optional. We guests come first. And joining us in just a few minutes to get into some of the more legalese discussion of this topic about emergency powers reform will be Judge Robert Flanders, but he'll join us in a few minutes. All right, so last June, I thought the General Assembly took an extraordinary step, and it kind of went under the radar. A lot of people didn't realize that in Article 3 of the budget that you passed and that you both voted for, Article 3, was limits on executive powers. Let's start with you, Representative Lima. You voted yes on Article 3, which put that 180-day limit on executive powers without General Assembly approval. Why did you feel that was important?
Oh, there was a large public outcry all year from the people. In fact, I was on the radio taking calls where they were very upset that the former governor was doing all these executive orders and renewing them and going on and on and on. And the people were saying, "Where are you? Where's the General Assembly?" And we were absent, and the people were right, and they were right to be irate about that. We could not call ourselves back into session. We needed the speaker to do that. The speaker at the time was involved in a very heavy race. So we just sat home basically all summer long while the governor was doing these executive orders without any input from the General Assembly. So this article in the budget was a way to curtail extending those emergency powers. And we said, okay, you got 180 days and that's it.
Rep. Newberry, and that's a great point, Rep. Lima. Thank you. So in addition to emergency powers, isn't this really about a balance of powers? I mean, maybe there are short-term emergencies where we give the executive that kind of unilateral control, but really, even in this pandemic, shouldn't we have had balanced governance all along?
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, look, state of emergency to me means, this is timely. A hurricane comes in, right? And does extensive damage or something like that. And back in 2020, March 2020, the original declaration, we didn't know what we were dealing with COVID. To my mind, the state of emergency should have ended in the middle of 2020. But as Charlene said, we weren't in session. That's water under the bridge now as to why we weren't. I couldn't do anything about it. But when we came back last June, I remember Governor Mckee, by May and June, everything was opened back up. I mean, the case counts were down low and, things were getting back to normal. And we were still under a state of emergency. I remember in early June, Governor Mckee extended, because they had to be extended every 30 days, I think. He extended the state of emergency again. I remember I was in session. I saw it on my phone. We were in session. I walked over to the speaker after session. I said, "Listen, do you know Mckee just extended?" He goes, "I know." He goes, I said, "Joe, we got to put a stop to this." And he said, "Don't worry, we're going to end it in the budget." So a week later, the budget comes out, Article 3 comes out, and the intention of the legislature was to put an end upon passage of the budget to the state of emergency. I can go into more detail from there, but that was what happened in June.
Yeah, of course, I agree with you. It should have happened long ago. And our organization was one of the first organizations to actually call. In fact, it was Judge Flanders, who will be joining us shortly in the Flanders Legal Center, put out a brief that clearly showed that the General Assembly had the authority after 30 days to weigh in and again, bring that balance of governments to it. Representative Lima, why do you think it took so long? Yes, these calls were starting, as Rep. Newberry said, over last summer, but yet it took until this June. What changed between last summer and this past June, where leadership finally took this seriously? Because there were bills both on the Democrat and Republican side trying to limit this as well. What do you think happened in June that made leadership realize we need to do this?
Well, we had a change in leadership. We elected a new speaker, a new majority leader, new leadership. We had a lot of new members who were elected who needed to get a feel for what was going on and how to address it. So I think that's what the delay was about. But once we got in there, we realized we had to do something. And as you know, we can't do things overnight. It's a struggle.
Yeah.
I'm dealing with 74 other personalities. We're dealing with the Senate and with the new governor. So they had to reach agreements on other things in the budget, but we wanted to make sure we got that in the budget.
All right. Rep. Newberry, you and I had an off-air discussion, and I hold a more cynical view, if you would, of this whole thing, that maybe this wasn't so much about emergency powers. Maybe what spurred leadership into action was this question over who gets to spend the $1 billion coming from the federal government in pandemic relief aid. And when the governor sort of said, well, under emergency powers, I have that. What was this, in your view, in any way, a internal fight over who gets to spend the money?
Oh, no, it was definitely partly that. I don't think I wouldn't even say that's a cynical thing to say. It's just the truth. And that's a normal governmental tug of war, right? Because the appropriations power lies with the legislature. And there is, I don't know exact details, but there's about $1.1 billion in federal money. And Governor Mckee was saying he had the authority to spend it. And there's no question that's why he extended the emergency declaration in June. And there's no question that's what finally spurred, the Speaker and the Senate President put an end to it. It wasn't the only factor, but it was definitely a major factor. I don't think that's a cynical thing to say or even a secret thing to say. I think that everyone knows that. So definitely it's part of the tug of war of the, as you put it earlier, struggle with separation of powers. And that's a normal governmental battle though,
All right, here's the actual,
clear answer.
all right, we're going to bring in Judge Flanders in just a second, but here's the actual language from there. So basically, the limitation said 180 days. The governor has basically unilateral authority to keep extending states of emergency, and then at which point the General Assembly must step in and either approve or not any subsequent extensions of those powers. Rep. Lima, is that your clear understanding right there on the four corners of what that says?
Yes. Yeah.
Rep. Newberry, there's a nuance here. So let's bring in Judge Flanders right now. And as we do that, I want to play a very interesting question that I think came up on this. I'm going to play of some video of Rep. Newberry on the House floor, because there was a question here. Well, when does the clock start on this 180 days, right? Did it start from the declaration of the first state of emergency, or did it start from the passage of this legislation, or some point in between? So let's play now the question that Rep. Newberry posed last June on the floor. So hold on one second. I'm a little clunky in getting to this stuff, but here we go. All right,
Here's my question is this. As I read that, I interpret this as assuming the budget passes and the Senate passes it and the governor doesn't veto it or whatever. I'm assuming that would immediately terminate the current state of emergency. And the reason I say that, I'm asking if that's the intent, because if it doesn't immediately terminate the current state of emergency, then it means that any governor could circumvent what I think we're trying to do by continuing to extend it every 30 days. Now, the question is, when it says shall not exceed a period of 180 days from the date of the emergency order or proclamation, etc., we have the original declaration made by Governor Raimondo, whatever date that was made, and my understanding is both she and now Governor Mckee have extended those every 30 days. Are we running the 180-day period from the date of the original proclamation, or are we intending to run it from the date of the latest extension? Because it makes a huge difference. If it's from the latest extension, this is basically a nullity, even though I agree with the intent of it.
Yeah, the intent is from the original date that we
I think that's only rational reading of it, but part of the reason I'm asking this question is if somebody does try to litigate, at least they can get that on record so we know we all agree with that.
So, interesting question. So it's not expressed in the language of the bill, but it was expressed on the floor that was the intent, that it is retroactive, and that basically when that bill was signed into law, emergency powers for the governor, in this case Mckee, were over. First of all, Rep. Lima, was that your understanding when you voted yes?
Yeah, especially when Brian got up and asked that great question, is when does the clock start ticking? And it was clearly answered, and our policy intent was when the initial order came out.
Now, before we go to Judge Flanders, Rep. Newberry, was there any thought of amending the language so that it was explicit in the language rather than have to rely on intent?
Well, no, because my whole point in asking that question, of course, I knew what the answer was going to be. It wasn't like I was surprising the finance chairman with the question, right?
Okay.
The whole point of reason to ask the question was, if I had drafted it, would I have drafted a little differently? Yeah, I would have. But the bottom line is, if that's not the intent, then the whole thing, it makes no sense. Like if you read it any other way, then they said, no, it doesn't make any sense. And courts who interpret statutes are not supposed to interpret them in a way that makes no sense.
Yeah,
so to me, it's clear cut.
All right, but it does leave a gray area. So Judge Flanders, welcome back to In the Dugout. Good to join us again, former Associate Justice of the Rhode Island Supreme Court. Judge, and I call you that colloquially, does that intent pass legal muster in a court of law if it were to be challenged, because it's not expressly written in the four corners of that legislation? What would be your opinion on that?
I think that is the best interpretation of it, particularly in light of subsection H, which says that nothing in the the language we've just been discussing is intended to apply to a list of executive orders that had been previously issued, but which can only remain in effect through September 1st, 2021. So to me, that's signaling that generally this is intended to apply to the existing executive orders, except that for the ones that are listed in subsection H, those are going to go up to, but not beyond, September 1st
Right.
of this year. So it seems to me pretty clear that.
Right. So you agree with Rep. Newberry that even though it's not expressly written, it is pretty clear cut.
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. All right. Now, we all thought, for all the talk in the early and middle part of this month, why isn't Governor Mckee issuing mask mandates for schools? Well, the truth of it is he was a governor without any clothes because he no longer had that authority. Does anyone, either of you three, disagree that prior to his declaration last week that he no longer held that authority to issue that mask mandate?
I have not spoken with Governor Mckee about this topic or any other topic in the last month and a half or whatever, but I expect that one of the reasons he did not issue a school mask mandate, whatever you think of the policy issue, is because he knew he did not have that power.
Even though it seemed like he wanted to pretend he had it, but wasn't issuing it for other reasons. And that's and it was a mystery to me why listen, it's pretty big news when a General Assembly limits a governor's powers. I mean, it was national news when it happened in other states. Yet in Rhode Island, it went under the radar. Rep. Lima, this was big news, but yet nobody knew about it. Is there a reason behind that you can think about? I didn't even know about this till early August, and we've been on top of this situation.
Kind of like the new Green Deal, I'm hearing from people now. Nobody knew when we did that. Unfortunately, it did not. The negative press gets the press and people pay attention. Something positive sometimes does not always get that. But I have a real problem with the governor issuing a mandate affecting the local communities, because it's kind of like a separation of powers thing there, and it's usurping the local community's powers. As far as like the masks, as an example, I think that should be up to the parents, the school committee, and the teachers to have a discussion on that. So communities are also different. A gun issue in Providence is very different than a gun issue in the suburbs. So every community is different and unique. So to have a statewide mandate on that, I think is doing a great disservice to the communities. And that's also why we need to have checks and balance. And
right, exactly. And here's where it gets interesting, because the whole emergency powers restrictions were thrown on its head last week when Governor Mckee declared a new state of emergency, restarting, as far as I see it, the 180-day clock again, claiming that the Delta variant is a new and different emergency than the original coronavirus itself. Judge Flanders, does that sound like that holds legal muster a variant of the same emergency can be a new emergency for powers purposes?
Yeah, the danger of that interpretation is that it basically guts the restrictions that the General Assembly imposed on the governor, because it's not hard to imagine that any alteration in the situation that existed when the original order was issued would be justification, supposedly, for a new mandate or a new order under the governor's emergency powers. And I don't think that was the intent here. I think, to go back to what both of these representatives have said, is that the model in Rhode Island and throughout the United States is separation of powers. The General Assembly is supposed to prescribe the laws, and the governor is supposed to execute them, and the judiciary interprets them. So when you have emergency powers where the governor is basically given for a limited period, supposedly, the power to not only enforce the laws, but to make them, and in some cases to interpret them, that's really the very definition of tyranny. And it's something that we here in the United States have taken great pains to avoid. So Well, yes, and during emergencies and remember, we're talking about disaster emergencies. The prototype would be a hurricane
Right.
or something of that magnitude that's supposed to last only for a limited period. So it's I think it's important to remember that there should be restrictions on the governor's emergency powers, and he ought not to be able to circumvent them simply by saying,
All
well,
right.
this
Yep.
is a variant, and
Yep.
let's start again.
Yep, great question, great point. Rep Newberry, did the governor just end run the General Assembly?
Yeah, here's what I think is happening. First of all, and you may not like this answer, but I thought about this. I think legally, any governor can declare a state of emergency anytime he wants to. Of course, it can be disingenuous and in bad faith and based on a false predicate, which is what I think Governor Mckee has done here. And of course, the General Assembly can convene at any time to remove that, which I think we should do right now. But I think what's really going on here is politics in the Democratic gubernatorial primary. It comes down to this. School mask mandates are a very controversial topic. People are split on them, okay? I was at a school committee in my own town last week. It was very heated on both sides. But among Democratic voters, according to polling, and just according to what I can see, just knowing people in my town, according to Democratic voters, they're very popular with Democratic voters. And Secretary Gorbea and Treasurer Magaziner, who everyone knows are both running for governor, and obviously Mckee are running for governor, both came out and blasted him for not issuing a mandate for masks. So I think he issued this new state of emergency to give himself the power to issue a school mask mandate. I think it's
Right.
as simple as that. I don't think it's
Right.
appropriate or proper, but that's what's really going on.
And I would suspect that was under pressure from in kowtowing to teachers unions. Now, Representative Lima, you're a Democrat, you're in leadership. I believe it was Speaker Shikarchi basically said, look, we don't have to reconvene. We don't have to intervene. The governor has new emergency powers. And it sounded pretty much like he said, and we're not going to do anything about it. The governor has what powers he wants, and he can do whatever he wants. Now, that's not the spirit of what the General Assembly passed in June. Rep Newberry just basically said the General Assembly ought to reconvene. And I think after 30 more days, they could end this new declared state of emergency. Would you support, Rep Lima, or do you think it's warranted for the General Assembly to get back involved and reclaim its rightful constitutional authority?
I absolutely would support that. I think that the position where, we got a virus that's going to continually mutate, that position is patently absurd, and it's trying to deceive the public. It's trying to pull the wool over the public's eyes. This is a new kind of a virus, a new mutation, so I have powers. Well, that can go on forever and ever. And what we're going to have is just one person doing whatever they want without any checks and balances from the General Assembly. So I think it's ridiculous, and I think we should go,
Wow.
hoping the governor will realize that and pull that executive order. If not, I think we should go in and clarify.
Wow. All right. So that's big news. We have the Deputy Speaker of the House and Representative Charlene Lima. We have the former House Republican minority leader of their caucus, Rep Newberry, both saying the General Assembly should step in and contravene the governor's new declared state of emergency. Judge Flanders, they have to wait 30 days, as I understand it, before they could, because the new declared, or could they step in now under the prior law they passed? What is the General Assembly's actual legal authority right now, or 25 days from now, as you see it?
Yeah, no, I think they could step in right now or anytime they want to and take hold of the situation. And look, they may agree with the governor, for all we know, if the majority really felt that way, that this was an emergency. But I agree with both of these representatives suggesting that this is just an end run around the idea that we had an emergency when the COVID hit. And if we're going to declare a new emergency for every variant, then that's going to basically gut the law. And so, but I think the General Assembly and the people want the General Assembly to weigh in on this as to what they think, and thereby have the checks and balances that we need. So I don't think they have to wait. I think they should act immediately and deal with this situation so that the people know one way or the other are their elected representatives behind what's going on, or aren't they?
Rep Lima, Rep Newberry, whoever, have either of you expressed this sentiment to leadership? Now, of course, Republican, Brian, you're in the minority. You don't have as much, but you have a relationship, I know, with leadership, and Rep Lima, you are part of leadership. Have you expressed these views up to the speaker as of this date?
I have in the past. As of now, he was a little incommunicado for a dental thing for a few days. And this new mandate just came out, but I do plan to express my views and my position on what I think we should be doing.
And do you think there are other Democrats who would join you in that?
I do.
You do. Rep Newberry, your view.
So I don't ever relay private conversations, but let me just say what I have a sense of. My feeling is that the speaker is not at all thrilled with the governor. I imagine, I don't know, I'm speculating the Senate president probably isn't either. But there's also a time and a place to publicly fight and feud. And, if this goes on beyond the 30 days, maybe you'll see action. If it blows over, if this gets extended for the 30 days, and it turns out the Delta variant just crests over everything and we don't have, ramped up hospitalizations and everything else, I think there's probably a sense that they're ticked off. They'll let it go this time. We'll see. In other words, I don't think you're going to see a General Assembly reconvene in August, early September to do anything. That does not mean they're in agreement. The leadership is in agreement with the governor. I think, sometimes there's other issues, there's other things in play, there's other tensions, and you pick fights where you can. It's easy for me to say we should reconvene tomorrow, and I believe we should. I understand why the speaker might have other priorities and is not going to pick that fight today. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen soon.
All right, I have another more cynical view of that I'm going to do in my closing remarks. But you both have made, I think, pretty important news today that this is not going to go unchallenged, or at least publicly, whether or not there'll be legislative action or whether some group will legally challenge this. But there are two potential courses. So I want to thank Rep Lima, Rep Newberry for joining us today. We're going to continue our discussion with Judge Flanders on some other legal issues. But Rep Lima, Rep Newberry, thank you very much for joining us on In the Dugout.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, very interesting. All right, Judge Flanders, let's just put it this way. I mean, they may institute some legislative action to contravene the governor's new declared state of emergency. Do you believe there's a viable case for legal action?
Yeah, I think that if someone who has a child in the schools or is otherwise adversely affected by one of the governor's emergency declarations, yes, that I would think they would have standing and to challenge the legality of the executive order on the grounds that we've been discussing.
Well, is this a case where you actually need to have harm in standing, or could the General Assembly just say, no, you just violated our law? I mean, I know standing's a difficult issue and burden to overcome in Rhode Island, but isn't it the General Assembly who was harmed there by having their law contravened?
Oh, sure, but you asked me whether someone could bring a legal action, and certainly the General Assembly could. But I was thinking you was
okay.
Asking
so
it
could go either way.
Broadly.
It could go either way. Then
it could go either way. The General Assembly, as I said earlier, certainly could step in. And they wouldn't need legal action.
Yeah, they wouldn't need to sue. They would just pass the legislation.
They would just act as the lawmaking body. But if someone decided to go to the courts, then I thought that's what you were asking me. And I do think that they would have standing if they were adversely affected by some executive order of the governor.
And what the sad thing here, and it's not a legal question, but it's a political question. And I think Rep Newberry nailed it. That it appears as if Governor Mckee, declared this new state of emergency just so he could appease the teachers' unions who are calling for K through 12 student mask mandates. That's how it appears to me. You were a member of the Board of Education. Would the teachers' unions have that much influence this is a political question now, not a legal one, but over a governor to force him to take such extreme action for one narrow reason?
Yeah, I mean, I don't profess any special political expertise to answer that question. It's possible, but obviously there are countervailing considerations. I don't know what the polling shows about how people feel about these mandates. I think there's probably split opinion in the electorate. So, you know, it's a politically risky move because obviously some folks are going to oppose it and others will be in favor of it. But how that shakes out, I don't profess to have any great insight.
All right, I want to bring up next. We talked about this. So the governor, well, as you know, let's just get things sequenced. I don't know if it was 10 days ago or so, the K through 12 Council on Education ordered masks for students. It was unclear if they had that authority at the time. So first of all, just quickly, yes or no, outside of a gubernatorial executive orders, emergency powers mandate, does the Board of Education have that authority, regardless of, you know, of a governor's declaration to issue a mask mandate?
Well, under the Emergency Act law, agencies do have certain powers. State health authorities and local code enforcement officials to make and enforce rules and regulations to prevent the introduction of any contagious or infectious disease and to safeguard the public health within the area.
So they have those powers outside of an emergency declaration? Like
no,
perpetually have those powers?
that's within the emergency declaration law.
All right, so at the time they made that mandate, Governor Mckee had not yet issued his new declaration. So that sounds like that would be a toothless mandate.
Well, the question is, were any of these executive orders that continue through September 1 under the law just enacted, the budget law, still in effect that would enable them to act in that way? And that would have to be researched. But remember, even the budget article does allow for certain mandates to continue through September 1.
All right, got it. All right, let's go to the town of Gloucester. So we've just to reset it up. So the governor declares a new state of emergency, dubious legal grounds on that, as we've discussed it, seemingly for one purpose, to issue a K through 12 school student mask mandate, which he did issue that executive order. But the town of Gloucester met last night, Monday evening, and unanimously did a couple of things. Very interesting. I like your legal take on this. As I understand it, first of all, one more setup piece. The Department of Education said, and this is Angelica Infante Green, if schools get uninterrupted funding, they have to have a mask mandate in their school plan for this year, starting next week or early September. Gloucester implemented a mask mandate last evening, but basically it was like Swiss cheese. They put a whole bunch. You could opt out or have an exemption if you had a medical exemption, if you had a religious exemption, if you had a conscientious objector exemption, which basically means if for whatever reason, as a parent, you didn't want your kids to wear masks in school, you could avoid the mandate. So first of all, I mean, that sounds like, is that a brilliant legal maneuvering for the town as a way to, put in a mandate, but one full of Swiss cheese holes? Or is it legally perilous in some way? Your thoughts on that as a judge?
Well, to me, this mirrors and mimics what's happening in the employment world, because as you know, employers are faced with the same issue. And the guidance they're getting from the federal authorities and the courts are that you've got to always allow for religious exemptions. You've got to allow for health exemptions, people who have breathing difficulties and so forth when wearing masks. So the exceptions are there even in the private sector. And now you're seeing that these are being taken up by towns like Gloucester, who realize that even if you implement a mandate regime for masks, you've got to have exceptions. And sometimes these exceptions are so broad and are so weakly described that basically, as you put it, anybody who wants to invoke an exception will probably be allowed to do so under one of these very loose descriptions of one way of getting out of wearing a mask.
So if the Department of Education, all right, so two angles on that. The Department of Education basically said, if you don't have a mask mandate, you might not get your funding. The town of Gloucester authorized its legal counsel to explore legal options if the Department of Education tries to say that's not a good enough mandate. Legally, does a Swiss cheese mandate qualify as a mandate?
It's all about the enforcement of it. If it's not enforced and it effectively negates the mandate, then no, it's not a mandate. But as I said earlier, there are legitimate and necessary exceptions that have to be present, including for religious and health-related reasons.
What about for conscientious objectors?
Well, that's that
Gray area?
that's a gray area, but it's akin in some ways to a religious objection.
So if the Department of Health were to withhold funding, you're saying they would be on very shaky legal ground if they tried to contest a religious exemption, correct?
Yes.
They would be on very shaky ground if they tried to withhold funding based on a medical exemption,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
And it would be gray area, questionable ground if they tried to withhold funding based on a conscientious objector exemption.
Yes.
So it almost seems like the town of Gloucester has pretty much checkmated the Department of Education, because even there's a lot of studies that show that masks are harmful to kids. They breathe in a lot of CO2 and psychologically and all that. So you could almost claim a medical exemption for that. So what do you think of what the town of Gloucester did? Was that a brilliant legal maneuver again, or what was it really risky, high risk legal maneuver?
Well, I think they tried to take a middle road because remember, if they go too far the other way, they're risking being sued by their constituents, their voters, as not, for example, respecting the constitutional right to religious observation and exercise, or if there's a legitimate health-related reason why someone can't wear a mask, they could be sued by voters and the parents of children. So I think they're trying to take a middle road here to preserve the funding that they want and need, but at the same time respecting
Parents' rights. Yeah.
people's rights to not go along with this mandate if they've got good grounds not to.
All right. One of the other things that town of Forest apparently did last night, again, I haven't seen it in the official record, but I was told by a very close observer to the situation, that they also authorized the legal counsel to file a letter with the Attorney General's office saying that that Council of Education's mandate from a few weeks ago requiring mask mandates was illegal in that they violated the Open Meetings Act, that they met not publicly, had discussions privately. I don't know the details of it. I don't know if you know any of the details of how that transpired with the Council of Education, but if you do, tell us. But what would Open Meetings Act require an entity such as the Council of Education to do as a process before they could legally pass such a mandate?
Well, among other things, it would require appropriate public notice of this subject being raised at a meeting so that people who had an interest in this issue could raise it and be in attendance and let their voices be heard in opposing it or in favor of it. And then they would have to appropriately document it in the minutes and put it on the agenda so that people can follow it. Yeah, so there are a lot of procedural process related issues that arise from the Open Meetings Act. And if in fact they can show that there was an appropriate notice given and publication of the notice and in the way the law requires, then potentially they could invalidate the action taken at the meeting based on that process related complaint.
All right, yeah, we'll have to wait and see their letter to see what specific violation of the Open Meetings Act they thought about. All right, last area to cover with you. And it kind of goes along with what I asked you earlier about the powers of the Council of Education. This talks about the regular powers of a governor. Governor Mckee last week made a number of claims, at least me as a layman understood it. First, as we discussed, he claimed there was or he declared a new executive emergency, new state of emergency. But he also, to me, I don't know if you heard his press conference, but he also repeatedly said that even outside of the state of emergency, that he always perpetually maintains certain executive powers to protect the health of its citizens outside of a state of emergency, and that he could therefore authorize certain actions even if there was no declared state of emergency. A, is that true? And B, if so, what is your understanding of the limits of that sort of, he cited some articles in the code of law that on that, but what is your understanding of that?
Well, the governor is given certain executive powers. Unlike the federal government, it's not a unitary executive. There are other executive officials who have responsibilities besides the governor to execute the laws. But he's basically claiming that he has some inherent power as governor and as someone who's been given executive power to do things even without authorization from the General Assembly. I think when he does that, he's on slippery ground because, for one thing, the General Assembly has now spoken and it's nipped his wings, so to speak, by limiting his health-related powers and emergency powers. But also, I mean, again, whenever you talk about inherent executive powers, it's supposedly to carry out the laws that already exist, not to make them up as you go. Whenever you get into that, to me, that's where you cross the line and step into the legislature's domain.
All right, I did fib, I'm sorry. I do need to bring up one more question for you, a different topic, but also having to do with parental rights and their children in education, and that's the critical race theory question. Here you're looking at a letter submitted by State Representative Patricia Morgan, Republican out of the Coventry, West Warwick area, to Attorney General Peter Nerona. And she's basically claiming that these race theories, these critical race theories and anything related to it could be a violation of Title IX of the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Equal Protection Clause, which bars discrimination based on race or skin color or anything like that. Would you tend to agree with Representative Morgan that any school district that allows these kinds of teachings might be violating the Federal Civil Rights Act?
I think you need to see what is actually being mandated in the curricula that are being taught in our schools. So I think the first step here is to have transparency and disclosure of what it is that is being taught, what's in the curriculum, what isn't in the curriculum, what sort of freedom do individual teachers and schools and school districts have to teach race-related subjects before you answer questions like, well, does it violate this, that, or the other thing on federal
Right.
law? Or
What is this? Yeah. What is this? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we need more disclosure, and I think that's why some of these battles are now being fought. Ms. Solas, for example,
Nicole,
is
yeah.
leading the charge on getting this information disclosed so we can see what it is, and before anyone races to conclusions about whether it violates any laws, let's find out what exactly is being taught, what's in the curriculum, and then we can go from there.
Okay. But that is in your view, if there was that evidence and we could identify what this is, the Civil Rights Act certainly would be a legal question that would be in play, could be in play.
Could be, yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right, Judge Flanders, as always, thank you for your time and joining us in the
Thank you.
dugout. And good luck with your Flanders Legal Center for Freedom. We'll have you back soon.
Yeah, and I always enjoy talking with you, Mike, because you remind me of Columbo. It's just one more question.
Yeah, I'm a curious kind of guy. Just like that's
Yeah.
why he was a good detective. Hopefully that makes me a good talk show host. We'll see. Thank you,
All
Judge.
right, have a good day.
So, wow. I mean, it's not often we break big news on this show, but what Representative Lima just informed us a few minutes ago, that she's going to publicly, well, she has publicly now said that she's in disagreement with the Speaker of the House, that she thinks it's prudent, and if not, and warranted was the word, to challenge the governor's new declared state of emergency, and that there's bipartisan support. We heard it from Representative Newberry, and that she believes there are other Democrats who will not take well to having the governor do this power play end around the General Assembly. I mean, this was this was actually for once, a bipartisan action in the General Assembly. So you heard Rep. Lima kind of feel like the governor has done an end around about us, but I wonder about that. I wonder if this was not all part of a secret backdoor scheme between the governor and General Assembly leadership, the Senate President and the Speaker of the House. I mean, just think about it. For 15 months, the General Assembly, as you heard Rep. Lima say, did nothing, while the executive branch put in questionable, sometimes even unconstitutional, admittedly unconstitutional executive orders. They suppressed the people's rights, religious rights, First Amendment's rights to gather, rights to work, rights to worship. They depressed our economy, they being the executive branch, but yet the General Assembly sat there for 15 months and did nothing. They didn't care. And keep in mind what someone years ago told me. Someone, I mean, when I say high up in the General Assembly, I mean high up in the General Assembly, almost as high as you can get, told me that you got to remember the operating philosophy here is to avoid voting or taking positions on controversial issues. So certainly managing your way through a pandemic, do we put restrictions? Do we put mandates? Do we do lockdowns? What do we impose? Those are controversial issues. And this cowardly General Assembly wanted nothing to do with that. Let the executive branch, let the governor deal with it, let the Department of Health deal with it, let the Department of Education deal with it. We don't want to touch it. We don't care if people's rights are being infringed upon. We don't care if the economy is getting blown apart. We don't care if people are losing our jobs. We don't want to touch a hot topic. And I believe that to be the case. So why, after 15 months, this just a few months ago in June, did the General Assembly put an end to those executive powers? And as you heard Brian Newberry, Representative Newberry say, and as I asked him, it was about money. When the General Assembly heard that the governor was going to claim unilateral powers under his emergency powers to spend the $1 billion in federal relief aid that's coming this way, that was a bridge too far for General Assembly leaders. They wanted their seat at that federal buffet so they could gorge themselves with all that money and spend it where they could best spend it so they could gain curry favor and gain votes and buy votes with that money. But I believe they cut a deal with the governor. Listen, we don't want to be touching the management of this pandemic. We want to leave that to you, but we've got to get our pound of flesh. We got to get our teeth sunk into this federal buffet of $1 billion or more. So we're going to declare an end to your emergency powers, just enough so that we can have the grounds to call a special General Assembly session later this fall so we can decide how to spend the money along with you. And then if you want to redeclare another emergency later in the summer and regain unilateral control of managing the pandemic, go for it. We won't interfere. That's what I believe is going on here. And I believe representatives like Charlene Lima, Representative Newberry, and any other honest politician in that General Assembly that voted for Article 3 because they wanted honestly and appropriately and constitutionally to return to a proper balance of powers when it comes to governance, even during a pandemic. Everyone who voted with all due honesty for that bill, I think, has just been played. And it's now obvious that they have been played, that their leadership and this governor schemed all along. How do we find a way for the General Assembly to have legal authority to make decisions on spending that money and all the crony stuff that goes with it? But yet, how do we manage it so that the governor retains, the executive branch retains executive powers, so we don't have to worry about it, so we don't have to take a stand on anything controversial? You know, for all the wrong reasons, we initially thought the General Assembly did the right thing. Even if it was for money, they still did the right thing for the wrong reasons in limiting and ending the governor's executive powers. Last week, that little dream turned out to be a fantasy. It poof, with one declaration by the governor declaring a new state of emergency and with statements from General Assembly leadership like, no, we're not going to do anything about it, even though that just shows how disingenuous their play was back in June with the budget. Why would they intervene in emergency powers then, but now say that they're going to be hands off on emergency powers for the executive branch now? This is corruption. This is back office double dealing. And I think General Assembly members have been played, as has the public. And it's very disappointing that Dan Mckee, I mean, we expect this of General Assembly. I mean, look at the people in jail, look at all the ethics issues going on. I don't think we expected this kind of backroom dealing from Governor Mckee. But this is what's going on. It's big news. I hope Charlene Lima can garner enough support to force the General Assembly to have an open hearing about whether or not they should end, as is their constitutional authority, they should end this frivolous and probably illegal new declared state of emergency by Governor Mckee. Leadership may have made a backroom deal with the governor, but the rank and file General Assembly members have not. And they will not like it when they learn they've been played. We'll see if Representative Lima can find other Democrats and the Republicans can stand together and the General Assembly can restore a proper balance and a constitutional form of government to our state, whether we're in a pandemic or not, whether we're in an emergency, which of course we're not, or not. This backroom scheming, this thirst for power, this thirst for money is just driving way too much of what happens in our government. Damn be constitutional parental student rights. The General Assembly in my view, cut a deal for the one thing that matters to them, money. The old adage is true. Always, it seems, with politicians, just follow the money. For In the Dugout, this is Mike Stenhouse. Please join us tomorrow. Dr. Andrew Boston on all things COVID and the FDA approval earlier this week of the Pfizer vaccine. For In the Dugout, good day.